seems like maybe even with like Peter, for instance, Peter did bad things, probably horrible things, even after having been exposed to Jesus in the flesh, perhaps more than any other person that Jesus dealt with. And then there were some that Jesus preached to, and they didn't listen, and he would move on and go preach to other people. But it's like Peter, every time he messed up, it was like a tender moment. And I don't know if it was that Jesus could sense in Peter or knew in Peter or about Peter that he was deep in his heart, that's what he wanted, was to do right, and he could sense that, and he could feel that. And I know on one occasion Jesus even thanked God, like, I'm thankful that these people didn't understand what I was talking about. It's like he knew that they weren't interested anyway. I don't know if that's what he saw in Saul. Like in David, he knew deep down David really did want to do what was right, and I don't know if that's why he pursued it. That's just my first thought initially. Right. I guess what I'm guess what I'm gonna have to do is humbly ask for God's help on that one, Tony. Like number three, I don't know. I'll have to ask what I'm not sure. Yeah. Mark? Yeah. David and oh, go ahead. Oh, you're good. Right there in verse 7, Tony sort of mentioned it that David went to God, and well, he had to go through the priest Abiathar in verse 7, but he says, "Bring me the ephod." That was like a garment that they would wear in order to, I guess, grant them access or at least represent their access to God. So Abiathar brought it to him, verse 8, and David asked him, "Should I go after these guys, the people that burned up Ziklag, took all the family and friends? Will I overtake them?" And God replied to him and says, "Pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue the people." So it seems to me like if I'm following the line of thought in 1 Samuel 30, maybe the next step in David getting back right with God, he had sort of ventured away from that for whatever reason, but now he's trying to get back to it, then it would be to humbly ask for help. Like whether or not it's because he had no other reason or place to go. It's like obviously he realized he was in this situation because of his own fault, and that there was something he was going to have to do to get back into that situation, being right with God. So he remembers the fact that he can go to him, whether it's past promises or whatever God had done for him. But now he humbly asks for his help. And the answer came pretty quickly in verse number 8. Go after them, don't worry about them. I'll take care of them. As far as I know, in that period of 16 months, like just looking back over the last few chapters, sort of in preparation for this. The best I could tell, this was the first time since David had been living in territory of the Philistines and posing as one of their soldiers and acting like everything was okay with them. This is the first time that David had asked God anything, that he had ever even mentioned to God, hey, I need your help. Help me figure out what I should do. 16 months, David didn't say anything to God. Now, of course, we might not have every detail, but at least in written record, this whole time David was living with the Philistines, like 16 months, nothing had ever been said to God. He was living on his own, fending for himself, most of the time prospering off of other people, taking things that wasn't rightfully his. But now, having been humbled, he's like, all right, I've got to cry out to God because I know that that's the only place I can turn. And I also find it pretty hopeful that once he repented, once he changed, or once he at least tried to fix the things that were wrong, then God immediately welcomed him back. That it was like, God recognized David's desire in trying to close the gap between the two of them. And so God responds and says, okay, I'll do this for you. It wasn't like a probation period. God didn't say, okay, wait, you got to wait for like 6 or 8 months and then I'll welcome you back. It's like hope for the worst of people among us, whatever it is we're dealing with. If you will come home to God, God will take you back. Now, it's hard to be humble and hard to humbly ask God for help, but I find it very hopeful that when we do, God meets us and gives us far more than we deserve. He did that with David in verse 8. He says, not only will you pursue them, but you'll overtake them, and you'll get back what you lost. You'll get the people back. You'll get what you lost and more if you'll just come home to God. Number 4, if I want to get closer to God or get back to God when I've found myself sliding away a little bit, I got to get back in the fight. Sort of a long reading, won't read all of it, but David essentially goes after the Amalekites. He's going to find them and pursue them just like God told him. He took 400 soldiers with him of the 600, which means he leaves 200 behind so that they could guard what little stuff they did have left in Ziklag. But 400 guys leave with David to go pursue the Amalekites. Eventually they found them, overtook them, and completely won a total victory. Look down at verse 18 in chapter 30. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. He also rescued his 2 wives. Nothing of theirs was missing from the youngest to the oldest, including sons and daughters, and all the plunder the Amalekites had taken. David got everything back. What David had lost through his sin, purely the grace of God, God restored. His part was to respond in obedience, to get back in the fight. Essentially. Number 5, very quickly, remember to focus on others helps me get back with God. Remembering that it's not just me that I've impacted, but with my sin, I've impacted and hurt other people. And so that's not just me that needs to be repaired. And essentially, I said 6, and I have 6, but I only put 5 on the screen. Maybe I lumped these 2 in my mind together about how he restored those broken relationships. Not only did he recognize the fact that he had hurt other people, but he did everything he could to fix what he had broken. Now look at verse 21. David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to go with him, and they had been left at the Wadi Besor. They came out to meet him and to meet the troops with him. And when David approached the men, he greeted them. But all the corrupt and worthless men among those who had gone with David argued, because they didn't go with us, we won't give any plunder recovered to them except for each man's wife and children. They may take them and go. So essentially the 400 were like, no, we can't share anything we just got back with them because they stayed here. They didn't come with us. They didn't put their life on the line to go pursue the Amalekites, so we're not going to give anything. Look what David says. My brothers, verse 23, you must not do that. With this, the Lord has given us. He protected us and handed us over to the raiders who came against us. Who can agree to your proposal? The share of the one who goes into battle is to be the same as the share of the one who remains with the supplies. They shall share equally. And so it has been from that day forward. David established this policy as a law and an ordinance for Israel, and it still continues today. When David came to Ziklag, verse 26, he sent some of the plunder to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a gift from you the plunder of the Lord's enemies. And so you have this focus of David realizing that it wasn't just him who was affected by what he had done. It was the 400 men that went with him. It was the 200 men that stayed back. And they all were recipients of what God had done through David as a result of repairing that broken relationship. And also that important note in verse 26 where it says David sent some of the gifts back to the elders of Judah. He realized that all this time, 16 months of living in Philistine territory, that the people who were ruling in Israel, his own people, the people that he was supposed to be responsible for and responsible to, he had let them down in his sin. And so it's like I want you to know that I'm sorry. I want you to know that I'm here for you. I want you to know that I'm willing to repair and fix the things that I've done wrong in this relationship. And that's really one part of true repentance, is realizing how deeply sometimes our sin hurts other people and then doing whatever we can to make it right. Those are just a few steps to me that leapt off the pages in 1 Samuel 30 about how David's journey back to God was catapulted by some of those things, but essentially how he was willing to face the truth and then ultimately ask for God's help, and then how God blessed him. Next week, we'll conclude in 2 Samuel chapter 1, look at the death of Saul in chapter 31, and then transition and kind of wrap our thoughts up on this study of turning points in David's life. But you could say that probably all of these chapters feature like more than one. There's a bad turning point where David maybe makes a bad decision. And then there's a good turning point where he straightens his life up, and how life constantly is turning point after turning point. But how I respond in those moments makes all the difference in my life. Appreciate your kind attention, your comments, and I look forward to our time together next week.